Welcome to the chaos sector. There is a major problem with the American people, it's not knowing who the main enemy is. Many conservatives believe their enemy is the liberal, and the liberals of course believe the conservative are theirs. All of the mudslinging from left to right to left, and everything in between, is stuck in an endless cycle of bickering. Mainstream media carries the water for both parties, pitting one against the other, which serves as a divisive agenda for society. Both sides blabber their rhetoric in pointless segments, pointing the finger at one another. What is a tyrannical government to you? Most think of the federal government agencies, such as the FBI, right? Well, they are merely the foot soldiers for the main enemy. That main enemy is those in Congress. Prior to the political drama of 2016, with the orange puppet entering the political matrix, most people didn't even acknowledge the United States Congress. Now though, you have a bit of transparency, where you are able to see them inside the House of Representatives. And these representatives are reflections of your typical political candidates. They speak a good game, but in the end, they are merely collecting a paycheck. They have done nothing that has benefited the American people. Just like your typical political candidates. Let's look into that. What bill has Congress passed that benefited the American people? I'll wait. These so-called representatives care only about themselves. If people think the typical politician doesn't care about the American people, where do you think they learned this from? Congress representatives. They spend hours at a day, yapping back and forth, getting absolutely nothing done for the citizens they so-called represent. And as for the gun debate, once again, these Congress representatives don't care about solving gun violence, because it has a simple solution. In today's episode, we focus on Republican Representative Clay Higgins. So tough, a no-nonsense kind of guy, so-called grills a police commissioner about red flag laws. Let's see if he actually grills him.
The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is now recognized. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Gramaglia, I'm looking at your presented statement, sir. Say you support confiscating guns from individuals determined to be a threat to themselves or others. Determined to be. So by this legislation my colleagues are putting forth, my understanding of the letter of that law, which I 1,000% oppose, as would our founding fathers, the letter of that law says an anonymous tip from a citizen. So if this was law, Commissioner, would you go to your neighbor's home and confiscate his legally owned weapons, a man that was not under criminal investigation nor under arrest? Would you do it?
Now right out of the gate, Higgins is framing the question very dishonestly. The premise of his question is about red flag laws. An anonymous tip is being focused on, but that is not the core focus of suspicion, or alert, in which action would be taken to confiscate an individual's firearm. Both sides specialize in tap dancing, they cunningly hover around the main issue.
The red flag laws would...
That's a yes or no, brother. I got 5 minutes to make an hour-and-a-half statement here.
It's more than a yes or no answer.
We'll move on then. If you cannot say yes, you would confiscate weapons from an American citizen that was subject to this law that my colleagues intend to push through this Congress, then you said in your statement that you would confiscate those weapons if an American was determined to be, your quote, a threat to themselves or others. According to that law, determined to be is defined by an anonymous tip that an American citizen is a threat to themselves or others.
Did you hear Grandpa Higgins? He must be suffering from memory loss, and it causes a lack of comprehension. If the commissioner stated he would confiscate firearms from someone who he believes is a threat to themselves and others, isn't this the appropriate action based on the criteria of the red flag law? Of course it is, but Higgins somehow tries to paint the commissioner out as violating that law by so-called confiscating firearms from his quote, law-abiding neighbor. It's not really an anonymous tip. The so-called anonymous tip is obviously anonymous in the public's view, or if the incident makes the news. But that person will provide the authorities with their information relative to the gun owner. For example, when someone is interviewed on the news regarding a security risk, they request that their face be blurred out, their voice altered, all to remain unidentified. But the reporter know how they look and how they sound. The public doesn't know this. Understand? So anonymous regarding red flag laws is to protect the identity of the individual relative to the gun owner. But Higgins is making it seem as if the anonymous person is a random stranger walking around, so-called snitching on law-abiding gun owners. You have to pay attention to details, or else they will slip one past you. Are you freaking serious? This is without a doubt pure madness.
You're a police commissioner, a thin blue line brother, sworn to uphold the Constitution, and you're saying you'd see those weapons. I see that as a problem. I'm going to bring us back in time to World War II. America's population, 140 million. 15 million American men came home from World War II with deep scars and significant skills. They bore the invisible wounds of war. There was weapons everywhere.
If you notice, Higgins claims that he doesn't have much time in his questioning, but he has no problem yapping on. He could have allotted that time in yapping to the commissioner in question. See, this is the problem in Congress, and why nothing gets done. Wanting the officer to answer with a simple yes or no, and when he states it's not a simple yes or no reply, Higgins then claims he doesn't have time for a lengthy answer. But he goes on to give his own lengthy blabbering in regards to his question. More concerned about feeding your narcissistic ego in the spotlight, and having your voice heard, rather than getting anything resolved. This is the problem with these representatives. They get paid entirely too much, and do entirely too little for the American people. But what do you expect with corrupt politicians? And the more cunning tactic used here is preventing the commissioner from thoroughly explaining the red flag law in the hearing. If this was done, Higgins, among others in the congressional hearing, wouldn't be able to disagree with the law. So he cuts him down, because he knows very well, the red flag law is an effective tactic in preventing gun violence. But how Higgins framed the question created a double-edged sword. If he states, yes, then he would confiscate weapons from his, quote, law-abiding neighbor. If he states, no, then Higgins would simply point out he said the opposite. So this tricky interrogating tactic shows Higgins is not a man of honor. Ask him the correct way, quote, do you support red flag laws? The commissioner would say yes, because that's why he's being interrogated. But don't create a cornering scenario where he can't answer the question due to you painting the neighbor as a law-abiding citizen. Do you understand? He could say no, I wouldn't confiscate firearms from my law-abiding neighbor. But all Higgins would do is claim he's lying, as he supports the red flag laws. But Higgins is not providing context to the red flag law, and he definitely isn't allowing the commissioner to do so. As a result, the commissioner isn't capable of establishing a base. He is being slated as committing unconstitutional acts, without actually doing so. Higgins didn't truly want an answer, he wanted to attack the commissioner, and paint the narrative he is violating the Second Amendment. That's why within seconds of the commissioner attempting to respond, Higgins interrupted and denied him any ability to express his views.
The red flag laws would...
That's a yes or no, brother. I got 5 minutes to make an hour-and-a-half statement here.
It's more than a yes or no answer.
We'll move on then. If you can't...
What this is about is putting everything on the record as a, quote, yea or nay response. But this isn't some frivolous issue, this is about gun violence, right? Let him at least, briefly, explain himself. So-called decorum in this madhouse of representatives doesn't exist. Let's continue.
We'll talk about mental challenge. My father was one of those men who was a Navy pilot in World War II. He came back from the war and built his family. I'm the 7th of his 8 children. I was born in 1961. We had guns everywhere. There was virtually no regulation. Any child in the 50s could buy a weapon from any seller if Daddy sent him with the money. We didn't have mass shootings. It wasn't until 1968 in America that serial numbers were even required on weapons sold in this country. You order weapons through the Sears catalog by the mail. In the 70s, I attended a high school, large rural school. Virtually every vehicle in the parking lot was a pickup truck, and almost every one had a rifle or a shotgun on the back glass and a pistol under the seat. And we didn't have school shootings. 1979, I began college. One of the jobs I had to work my way through college was as a carpenter. We restored historical buildings. We had to determine in the process of that work what was the original cuts of these homes, residential homes built 75, 85, 100 years ago. You could tell by the saw cut if it was a mechanical.
This isn't the time for reminiscing on your upbringing, sir. There are so-called children being massacred in schools. Different era in society, but to be honest, even with him time traveling back to his youth, it wasn't a utopia. Gun violence did exist, so the point was a bit off. This self-aggrandizing of Higgins could have been eliminated and redirected that time to allowing the commissioner to explain his stance on red flag laws. But these representatives have become enamored with cameras focused on them, and their so-called viral moments in these hearings. Meanwhile, nothing has been proposed on Higgins' behalf, nor his party, regarding red flag laws. If you are only to criticize something Democrats propose involving gun violence, it appears you are in fact an indirect source of gun violence, as Democrats suggest. Since you are trying to resolve, or negotiate, the law proposed for gun safety, let the officer explain the elements of the red flag law, so you can negotiate a plan that satisfies both sides. But Higgins doesn't want this. He only intended to paint the narrative of citizens being unlawfully targeted, and having their guns confiscated. This is the propaganda pushed from the right, so he will not deviate from that. The answer is not as simple as yes or no. A red flag law does state that an anonymous tip can contribute to the confiscation of firearms. But let's use common sense here. The so-called anonymous tip would come from someone who is either familiar with that person, friends with that person, related to that person, or even the spouse of that person. How else would someone know you had the weapons, unless they were familiar with you in some manner? So the anonymous tip is simply someone that wants to protect their identity, because they don't want to betray the gun owner's trust. And that's not the only thing that leads to this confiscation. There are protocols put in place, where information, or even evidence, supports the need to confiscate that firearm, or several firearms, from that individual. A red flag law is a gun violence prevention law that permits a state court to order the temporary removal of firearms from a person who they believe may present a danger to others or themselves. A judge makes the determination to issue the order based on statements and actions made by the gun owner in question. An April 2018 poll found that 85% of registered voters support legislation that would, quote, allow the police to take guns away from people who have been found by a judge to be a danger to themselves or others. Unquote. Now these are citizens supporting the red flag law. Keep in mind it's a red flag law. Meaning, potential danger or risk is the reason behind the law being enforced. Now of course those on the right would consider any potential danger or risk a subjective standard by which the law is being enforced. Sure, but isn't it better to be safe than sorry? The law allows that individual to obtain their firearms after evidence proves they are not a risk. It seems to be a violation of the Second Amendment, but this is the problem the so-called mass shootings have created. There will be an impact on gun rights, in some form. The key though, is to not violate the Second Amendment, but still effectively prevent gun violence. It's all fake anyway, but for the sake of the garbage we break it down. Higgins tried to create a scenario where some random person in society calls the authorities on a gun owner. In that context, it would obviously be unreliable, due to the subjective view of a, well, random person. They are not random, they are individuals who know the gun owner in some magnitude. For example, a guy has several firearms in his home. He has a family, wife and 2 children. Neighbors have noticed a bit of anger from him, or even disassociation, as he doesn't speak to them as much as before. They have overheard him and his wife arguing in their home, and feared that he may become an abuser. They report this, anonymously, and authorities investigate the issue. They discover that he has been in therapy for his anger. By processing him through the red flag law, a judge determines that he is not mentally fit to own firearms, as he poses a potential threat to himself, his family, and others. Now some may suggest, this is not enough evidence to take his weapons away. But these are the type of settings where the individual so-called shoots their spouse, the children, and then themselves, right? Happens frequently. The red flag law is simply a preventive measure. But, since we are in the matrix, it was intentionally drafted the wrong way, which provokes the political mudslinging. The more comprehensive red flag law will be what we proposed in previous episodes. Once an individual attempts to purchase a firearm by way of a gun merchant, such as an auctioneer, pawnbroker, or gun conventions, they are screened by the federal government. The same procedures apply with this screening as the red flag laws. If the individual passes the screening, then they are allowed to purchase the firearm. If they fail the screening, they are denied, and even temporarily investigated as a potential environmental threat. Seems a bit much. Well, unfortunately, the so-called mass shootings have created this procedure. Republicans can whine till the cows come home about it, but the so-called mass shootings will rapidly decline, right? In fact, it's actually the best strategy, if you think about it. Law-abiding citizens would obviously pass the screenings, as they are cleared with background checks. So, what demographic in society would have a problem with this gun law? I'll tell you who would have a problem: the ones that are so-called committing the so-called mass shootings, that's who. They would have no place to hide, as they wouldn't dare attempt to purchase firearms, with the new federal government screenings mandated in all states. And there's the solution. So easy, isn't it? No complicated drafts presented, no complex procedure citizens have to partake in, just a simple screening, and you weed out the bad guys. You have to remember, in the so-called mass shootings, those individuals purchase weapons legally, yes, legally. So the system is flawed, right? Uh-oh, we take that scope, and direct it back to who? The ones that create the laws. Aha, what to make of this conundrum? Representatives in Congress are the ones who vote on laws to be passed. And it goes through a process of negotiation before it's either passed or rejected. But, since the gun laws that exist currently have not prevented so-called mass shootings, who do we blame for this? The federal government? Well, this consists of the very congressmen and women. The federal government agencies, such as the FBI, CIA, ATF, and NSA, enforce the laws that Congress passes, right? Pay attention here, because the problem is not primarily those agencies, it is the individuals who sit around yapping all day in the House. They have all the power, they declare war, they pass the laws, they sign legislation, all of the power the United States holds is in that building. So, the reason so-called mass shootings continue to happen is because both parties are intentionally avoiding real solutions to the problem, which only reveals the main objective: political divide and conquer in society. This is the chaos sector.